Today we're talking about world building. A long time ago, I wrote an article about world building on my blog, and I'll link that in the description. In the article, I went over 10 elements of world building, but today we're just going to talk about one of them, government types. But before we do that, let's talk about world building. World building means all the work that an author does to make a fictional world seem real. Every author uses world building, but it's especially important in genres that are not set in our real world. So we're talking sci-fi, fantasy, young adult, dystopian, stuff like that. And these stories, authors have to create completely unique settings through world building. And these fictional worlds are a huge part of what attracts readers to these genres. If you don't believe me, just go look up any YouTube channel that's dedicated to the lore of a specific franchise, like Star Wars or Harry Potter or whatever. People will spend hours consuming information about the fictional histories, cultures, geographies, political systems, and philosophies of their favorite movies, books, or shows. And world building is really just the act of creating the lore of your fictional world. So, long story short, it's important. That's why I'm going to make a series of videos about the 10 elements of world building, but for today we're just going to talk about government types. Now, to talk about government types, we are going to go over several real-world examples of government types. If you're creating your own story, you can use these real-world examples to organize the governments of your fictional world. Or you can combine one or more of these types of governments to create a unique government type for your world. Unique. So, let's get into it. Different ways to organize governments exist all throughout history in the world. We're obviously not going to talk about every one of them, but we're going to describe the most common. These are all real-world examples, but these are also government types that you'll find in fiction. Authors often pull facts from the real world when they're building their fictional ones. We'll go through each system one at a time, and I'll give a very brief and basic description of each. Quick disclaimer though, I'm not a political scientist, so there's a good chance that I'll get some things wrong. If I do, you can let me know in the comments. And when I say government types, I'm just describing where power is vested. Is it with a large group of people, a small group of elite individuals, or one individual like a king or queen? I'm not going to go into depth on political or economic structures just because we can't be here all day. If you decide to use one of these government types in your story, I recommend you do further research. And pick a government type that works for the world that you're creating. And most importantly, make sure it creates some sort of conflict for your narrative. Any government type can create conflict, even ones that we consider positive, like democracies or republics. So with that, let's get started with Empire! Empires are big. That's pretty much their defining quality. They also last a really long time, and real-world examples include places like the Roman Empire that lasted for hundreds of years. Empires are often made of smaller states with their own governing bodies, but the larger state is controlled by a single person, usually an emperor or empress. The emperor has absolute say over what happens within the government. The emperor or empress can override decisions of smaller governments, and empires are grand in scale, covering vast territories. Emperors can be benevolent and wise, like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or they can be malevolent and crazy, like his son Commodus.
I would put to the whole world if you would only love me.
Besides the Romans, other examples of empires include the Han Dynasty, established in 206 BCE, and spanning modern China, Vietnam, and Korea. The Umayyad Caliphate from 632 CE, which at its peak was as large as 4 million square miles, one of the largest empires in history. And we have a modern example in the British Empire, which comprised a quarter of the planet during the 20th century. And its remnants still exist today in the form of the Commonwealth of Nations, including countries as far-flung as Canada, Australia, and South Africa. But let's move on to monarchies. In a monarchy, the state is ruled by a single ruler, but this time it's a king or queen. Succession is determined by birthright, and a family will rule for several generations. Monarchs often claim a divine right, believing that a god or gods chose them to rule. or at least claiming that. Monarchies are all about keeping power concentrated in a small number of families. That's why so many European royal families are related. Royals are constantly marrying other royals from other countries to keep the power concentrated and secure alliances. Again, you could have a kind or cruel king because power is inherited, and it's really just the luck of the draw. This is where you're going to notice some overlap. Like, an empire can also technically be a monarchy if the leader of that empire is a king or queen. In fact, the British Empire was ruled over by a monarch. And although the British Empire is no more, the United Kingdom still boasts a royal family to go along with their representative government in a system called a constitutional monarchy. A third government that's ruled over by a single individual is a dictatorship. However, dictators don't claim divine rights like kings or queens, and power isn't usually inherited. Rather, they often come to power through political means or through military force. These leaders control through the power of their personality and charisma. Dictatorships are often oppressive regimes where individual freedoms are strictly limited by the state. At the very least, dictatorships are intolerant of political pluralism, meaning no more than one dominant political party at a time, and they often tightly control the media. Dictators will often rise to power in times of crisis and are not afraid to use violence for political means. Dictatorships were a dominant style of government during the 20th century, and historical examples include Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Spain. In a dictatorship, power is vested in a single person, but on the other end of the spectrum we have
Democracy!
A democracy is a political system in which power is vested in the people. You know, the old of the people, by the people, for the people, that kind of stuff. Decisions are voted on either directly by the people or by elected representatives. If you have elected representatives, we call that a representative democracy. But in a pure democracy, citizens vote without any sort of proxy, and the majority rules no matter what. Decisions in a pure democracy are made by voting, where almost every citizen takes part. The rights of groups in the minority are often trampled by the rule of the majority. There are no representative bodies like senates or parliaments. A pure democracy works best with a small community. One of the earliest recorded pure democracies was the Greek city-state Athens during the 5th century. Decisions there were voted on by a popular assembly that was open to all male citizens. A government closely related to democracy, but with just some subtle differences, is a republic. A republic is like a democracy, but decisions are voted on by a body of elected representatives. A president or prime minister will head up an executive branch. Voters elect members to the government to make decisions in their best interest. These representative bodies often have upper and lower houses. Think like the US House of Representatives versus the Senate, or the United Kingdom's House of Lords versus the House of Commons. These houses vote on proposed laws, and this split system is called a bicameral legislature. The reasoning behind a bicameral legislature, at least in the US, is for separation of power, with the House of Representatives assigning members to Congress proportional to their population, and in the Senate, each state has an equal number of 2 senators. This is supposed to guarantee that smaller states get an equal say in the government. There are many types of republics, from ancient Rome to the current system in the US and the constitutional monarchy of the UK. But let's say you're writing a story where a single religion has amassed a huge amount of power. Well, then you might want to use a theocracy. A theocracy is a form of government where religious leaders rule in the name of God or gods. There is no separation or difference between the church and the state, and laws are indisputable and governed by religious doctrine. A religious leader will be at the head of the government. Examples of theocracies exist throughout history. Ancient Egypt was a theocracy, where the pharaoh was worshipped as a direct descendant of the sun god Ra. Modern examples include the Vatican, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, here's a government type that usually works alongside democracies and republics: a federation. A federation is a government where smaller states are organized by a central government. Each individual state manages their own internal affairs. However, the central government outweighs the state governments. Again, we have some overlap here. A federation will normally use a representative government like a republic. Each local government will have a say in issues that affect the whole, while the larger federal government will have ultimate say in decisions. Although the US is a republic, it is also a prime example of a modern federation. Actually, a lot of modern countries are federations. In fact, according to Wikipedia, the following countries are Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Bosnia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, Malaysia, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Russia, and Switzerland. On the opposite end of the spectrum from federations, we have confederations. Okay, a confederation. So take the idea of a federation and just flip it. In a federation, the centralized government is the big dog and the weaker local governments have to go with the show. But in a confederation, the local governments are the decision makers. The central government is mainly used for administrative tasks. It can't override decisions made by local governments. Modern examples include the European Alliance and United Nations. Okay, now let's talk about our final government type, an oligarchy. In an oligarchy, power is vested in a small group of elite individuals. These groups are usually made up of people with wealth, nobility, or military power, and influence is passed from one generation to the next through inheritance. Basically, a small group of rich people control the government. There are many other types of governments beyond what we've talked about, and this is an area where you'll need to do a lot of research to decide which government best suits your needs and the needs of your plot. If you think I missed anything, or I just got something wrong, let me know in the comments. Again, on my website, I have an article that covers the 10 elements of world building beyond just government types, and I'll link that in the description below. Until next time, keep writing.